The rusted mailbox leaned at a dangerous angle, its numbers barely visible through layers of peeling paint and decades of neglect. $300. That's all it had cost Marcus Sullivan to buy what the locals called the most cursed piece of property in Ashford County. The realtor had practically begged him to reconsider, her nervous laughter echoing in the cramped office as she shuffled through paperwork with trembling fingers. But Marcus wasn't looking for a bargain. He was looking for a place where the world would finally leave him alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gravel road crunched beneath the tires of his battered pickup truck as Marcus navigated the final turn toward what would be his new home. Pine trees towered on both sides, their branches creating a natural tunnel that filtered the late afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns across his windshield. The silence here was different from the kind he'd grown accustomed to in the crowded Veterans Hospital back in Portland. This wasn't the hollow quiet of medicated sleep or the artificial hush of therapy sessions. This was the deep, ancient silence of a place that had been forgotten by time itself. Marcus Sullivan was 41 years old, though the lines etched around his green eyes and the premature silver threading through his dark brown hair suggested someone who had lived far longer. 6 feet tall with a lean, wiry build that spoke of both military discipline and the hollow hunger that sometimes followed men home from war. He carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned that every movement mattered. His hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the steering wheel with the same intensity he had once reserved for his rifle. 2 tours in Afghanistan had left their mark on more than just his body. The truck's engine wheezed to a stop as the cabin came into view, and Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The photographs from the real estate listing had been charitable at best. What sat before him wasn't just an old cabin, it was a monument to decay. The structure sagged in the middle like a broken spine, its wooden walls stained black with moisture and time. Several windows were boarded up with sheets of plywood that had warped and buckled, creating gaps that looked like missing teeth in a skull's grin. The front porch had partially collapsed, its support beams jutting out at odd angles like broken bones, but it was the isolation that drew him. The nearest neighbor was 12 miles away, according to the realtor, and the property sat on 37 acres of dense woodland that hadn't seen a human footprint in years. It was perfect for what he needed, a place to disappear. Marcus pushed open the truck door and stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the cabin. Weeds and wild grass had reclaimed what had once been a driveway, and the air smelled of pine sap, rotting wood, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Something that reminded him of the caves in Kandahar, where he'd spent 3 days hiding from Taliban fighters, breathing in the metallic scent of fear and damp earth. A soft whine came from the passenger seat, and Marcus turned to open the other door. Scout, his 3-year-old border collie mix, leaped down with the eager energy that had been his salvation during the darkest months after his discharge. The dog was medium-sized with a striking coat of black and white fur that seemed to shimmer in the filtered sunlight. His intelligent brown eyes immediately began scanning their new surroundings, his pointed ears swiveling to catch sounds that Marcus's damaged hearing couldn't detect. Scout had been a rescue from a shelter in Eugene, a traumatized animal who had been found wandering the highways after his previous owner died in a car accident. The parallels hadn't been lost on Marcus when he'd first seen the dog cowering in the corner of his kennel, flinching at every sound. They had recognized something in each other, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive when survival felt like a punishment. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked, his voice rusty from disuse. He rarely spoke anymore, except to Scout, and even then it was usually just simple commands or observations. The therapy sessions had been full of talk about processing and healing and moving forward, but Marcus had found more comfort in Scout's silent presence than in all the well-meaning words of the psychiatric staff. Scout trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, following some scent trail that only he could detect. Marcus watched the dog's body language carefully. It was something he'd learned to do over the past 2 years. Scout's behavior often served as an early warning system for Marcus's own episodes. When the nightmares came, or when the sound of a car backfiring sent him diving for cover behind the nearest solid object, Scout was always there, pressing his warm body against Marcus's chest until the panic subsided. The cabin's front door hung open, revealing a rectangle of impenetrable darkness beyond. Marcus approached slowly, his hand instinctively moving to his hip, where he had once carried a sidearm. The motion was automatic, a muscle memory that would probably never fade. He pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from his jacket pocket and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows to reveal the interior of his new home. The smell hit him first, musty, oppressive, with undertones of mildew and something sweeter that made his stomach clench. The beam of his flashlight revealed a single room that served as both living area and kitchen, with a narrow doorway leading to what he assumed was a bedroom. The floor was covered in a layer of leaves and debris that had blown in through the broken windows, and the walls were stained with water damage and what looked like decades of neglect. But it was structurally sound according to the inspector's report. The foundation was solid, the roof would need work but wasn't in immediate danger of collapse, and the well still produced clean water. Most importantly, it was his. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Marcus owned something that no one could take away from him. Scout had finished his initial exploration of the exterior and now padded up to the threshold of the cabin. But instead of following Marcus inside, the dog stopped abruptly, his entire body going rigid. His ears flattened against his head, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not the excited sound he usually made when investigating new places, but something else entirely. Marcus turned back toward his companion, noting the change in the dog's demeanor. Scout's tail, which had been wagging moments before, now hung low between his legs. His brown eyes were fixed on something beyond the doorway, something Marcus couldn't see. "What is it, Scout?" Marcus asked, stepping back outside. He'd learned to trust the dog's instincts implicitly. There had been too many times in Afghanistan when the local dogs had detected IEDs or enemy movement, long before any of the sophisticated equipment could pick up the threat. Scout backed away from the cabin entrance, his gaze never leaving whatever had captured his attention. He circled around to the side of the building, stopping near a section of the foundation where the wooden walls met a series of large moss-covered stones. His whining became more insistent, and he began pawing at the ground near one particular stone. Marcus followed, crouching down beside his dog. The stone Scout was focused on was larger than the others, roughly rectangular in shape, and it seemed to be slightly out of alignment with the rest of the foundation. Marcus ran his hand along its surface, feeling the cold, damp moss beneath his fingers. There was something carved into the stone, markings that were too deliberate to be natural weathering. He directed his flashlight beam at the stone's surface, and his breath caught. Carved deep into the rock were symbols that looked almost like letters, but worn down by time and weather until they were barely recognizable. He could make out what might have been an H and possibly an E, but the rest was too eroded to decipher. Scout's agitation increased, and he began scratching at the earth around the base of the stone with his front paws. The soil came away easily, as if it had been disturbed before. Marcus found himself helping, using his hands to clear away the loose dirt and rotting leaves. As they worked, more of the stone became visible. It wasn't part of the foundation at all. It was a separate piece, placed deliberately at the base of the cabin, and it was hollow underneath. Marcus could feel the edges where the stone formed a sort of crude lid or cover. "Easy, boy," Marcus murmured as Scout's digging became more frantic. The dog's behavior was starting to worry him. In all the time they'd been together, he'd never seen Scout react to anything with this level of intensity. Marcus managed to work his fingers under one edge of the stone, finding a grip that allowed him to lift it slightly. It was heavier than he'd expected, and it took considerable effort to shift it aside. Beneath was a cavity that had been carved or dug into the earth, roughly the size of a shoebox. The smell that rose from the opening was unlike anything Marcus had encountered before. It wasn't the simple earthiness of soil or the mustiness of decay. It was something older, more complex, a scent that seemed to carry with it a weight of years and secrets. Scout immediately backed away, his whining taking on an almost frantic quality. Marcus played his flashlight beam into the cavity and saw something that made his pulse quicken. There was an object wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth, dark with age but still intact. Beside it were several smaller items, a tarnished metal locket, what appeared to be a bundle of letters tied with string, and something that gleamed dully in the light. His military training kicked in, the same careful methodology that had kept him alive during house-to-house searches in hostile territory. He didn't immediately reach for the objects. Instead, he studied them, looking for any signs of danger or instability. The cloth wrapping looked stable enough, and there were no visible wires or mechanisms that might indicate some kind of trap. But why would someone hide these things here? And why had Scout reacted so strongly to their presence? Marcus carefully lifted the wrapped object from the cavity. It was surprisingly light, and the cloth fell away easily in his hands to reveal what looked like an old journal or diary. The leather cover was cracked and faded, but the binding was still intact. He opened it carefully, squinting at the faded ink on the first page. The handwriting was spidery and difficult to read, but he could make out a date at the top, October 15, 1952. Below that, in the same careful script, were the words "Property of Helen Cartwright. If found, please return to Ashford Township." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Helen Cartwright. The name meant nothing to him, but there was something about seeing it written in such careful, deliberate letters that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Scout had stopped whining, but he remained at a distance, watching Marcus with an intensity that was almost human in its focus. Marcus turned the page and began to read. "I don't know who will find this or when, but I pray that someone will understand what happened here. What's still happening here. The dream started 3 weeks after we moved into the cabin. At first I thought it was just the stress of the move, or maybe the isolation getting to me. Harold said I was imagining things, that it was just the old house settling. But houses don't whisper your name in the middle of the night. Houses don't make you see things that aren't there." The writing became more erratic as it continued, the letters slanting and running together, as if the writer had been in a hurry or frightened. "The children in the woods. They watch from between the trees, but when I try to get closer, they disappear. Sometimes I can hear them laughing, but it's not a happy sound. It's the kind of laughter that makes your blood run cold. Harold thinks I'm losing my mind, but I know what I've seen. I know what I've heard." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. He glanced up at Scout, who was still watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, and then back at the journal. His hands were trembling slightly as he turned to the next page. October 22, 1952. "Found footprints in the mud by the well this morning. Small ones, like a child's, but wrong somehow. The toes were too long, and there were marks that looked almost like claws. Harold said it was probably just a raccoon or some other animal, but I've seen animal tracks before. These were different." The entries continued, each one more disturbing than the last. Helen Cartwright wrote about sounds in the walls, about cold spots that moved through the cabin like living things, about dreams where she found herself standing in the woods in the middle of the night, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. November 3, 1952. "Harold is dead. They found him at the bottom of Miller's Gorge this morning, but I know he didn't fall. He was terrified of heights, wouldn't even climb a ladder to fix the roof. But Sheriff Morrison says there's no evidence of foul play, and I can't tell him what I really think happened."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Who would believe me if I said my husband was taken by something that isn't supposed to exist? Marcus's hands were shaking now, and he had to stop reading. The October air suddenly felt much colder, and he found himself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see the silhouettes Helen Cartwright had written about. Scout had moved closer again, pressing against Marcus's leg in the way he did when he sensed distress. November 10th, 1952. I'm leaving tomorrow. I can't stay here anymore. Every night they get bolder, coming closer to the cabin. Last night, one of them pressed its face against the bedroom window. I saw its eyes, black like a shark's, but intelligent, malevolent. It smiled at me, and I saw teeth like broken glass. The final entry was dated November 11th, 1952. I'm burying this journal tonight, along with Harold's letters and my mother's locket. Maybe someone will find them someday and understand what happened here. Maybe they'll have better luck than we did. I pray they'll be smart enough to leave this place alone. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Whatever you do, don't let them know you can see them. Once they know you're aware of them, they'll never leave you alone. Marcus closed the journal with hands that he couldn't quite keep steady. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been trained in military intelligence and had learned to separate fact from fiction under the most stressful circumstances, told him that Helen Cartwright had probably been suffering from some form of mental illness. Isolation could do terrible things to the human mind, especially in the 1950s when mental health resources were limited and stigmatized. But another part of him, the part that had learned to trust instincts over logic in the mountains of Afghanistan, wasn't so sure. Scout's reaction to the hidden cache, the way the dog continued to watch the tree line with such intensity, suggested that something about this place was genuinely wrong. Marcus carefully rewrapped the journal and placed it back in the cavity, along with the other items he hadn't yet examined. He replaced the stone cover, though he noticed that Scout relaxed considerably once the opening was sealed again. As he stood and brushed the dirt from his hands, Marcus caught a movement in his peripheral vision. He turned toward the trees, his combat instincts flaring to life, but saw nothing. Just the gentle sway of pine branches in the evening breeze. But for just a moment, he could have sworn he'd seen something small and pale moving between the trunks. Scout growled, a low warning sound that Marcus had never heard from him before. The dog's attention was fixed on a cluster of trees about 50 yards from the cabin, his body tense and ready to either fight or flee. "What is it, boy?" Marcus whispered, following the dog's gaze. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper now, more substantial. And was that a sound he was hearing? Something like children playing in the distance. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and the temperature was dropping fast. Marcus made a decision that surprised him. Despite everything he'd just read, despite Scout's obvious distress, despite the growing sense that he'd made a terrible mistake in coming here, he picked up his duffel bag from the truck and headed toward the cabin. He wasn't running away. Not this time. He'd spent the last 2 years running from his memories, from his guilt, from the nightmares that followed him wherever he went. If this place wanted to scare him, it would have to do better than some old journal and his dog's nerves. Besides, he'd faced worse things than ghost stories in the caves of Afghanistan. Whatever was waiting for him in these woods, he doubted it could be more terrifying than the very real human monsters he'd encountered in the war. Scout reluctantly followed him to the cabin door, though the dog's reluctance was obvious in every step. As Marcus pushed open the door and stepped into the musty darkness of his new home, he heard something that made him pause. Laughter. Faint and distant, but unmistakably the sound of children playing. It seemed to come from the direction of the trees where Scout had been focused, but when Marcus stepped back outside and listened carefully, the sound faded away like an echo. He spent the next hour setting up a basic camp inside the cabin, rolling out his sleeping bag near what remained of the old fireplace and arranging his few possessions within easy reach. Scout stayed close, never straying more than a few feet from Marcus's side. When Marcus lit a small camp stove to heat water for coffee, the dog positioned himself between Marcus and the door, facing outward like a sentry, As full darkness settled over the forest, Marcus found himself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. Every creak of the old wood, every whisper of wind through the broken windows, seemed magnified in the silence. He'd expected the isolation to bring him peace, but instead it felt oppressive, as if the darkness outside was pressing against the cabin walls with deliberate intent. Scout's behavior became increasingly agitated as the night wore on. The dog would periodically rise from his position by the door and pace to one of the boarded windows, listening intently to something Marcus couldn't hear. Each time, the dog would return to his post with a low whine, as if reporting that the threat was still there. Around midnight, Marcus was jolted awake by a sound that sent ice through his veins. It was a scratching noise, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something with claws was raking them down the side of the cabin. Scout was already on his feet, hackles raised, growling at the wall where the sound seemed to originate. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and moved carefully toward the source of the noise. The scratching continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly. When Marcus played his light through a gap in one of the boarded windows, he saw nothing but empty darkness. But in the dirt beneath the window, illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, were fresh scratches in the earth. They looked almost like letters, though too crude and uneven to read clearly. As Marcus stared at them, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, a new sound drifted through the night air, singing. A child's voice, thin and reedy, carrying a melody that was almost familiar but not quite. The song seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several children were spread throughout the forest, all singing the same tune but slightly out of sync with each other. Scout's growling intensified, and the dog moved to stand directly in front of Marcus, as if trying to protect him from whatever was outside. The singing continued for several minutes, growing louder and more discordant, before finally fading away into the whisper of wind through pine needles. Marcus spent the rest of the night sitting with his back against the wall, Scout pressed against his side, both of them listening to the sounds of something moving through the darkness outside. Footsteps that were too light to be human, voices that spoke in languages he didn't recognize, and always underlying it all, the sense that they were being watched by eyes that reflected no light. When dawn finally broke through the gaps in the boarded windows, the forest fell silent. Scout relaxed enough to lie down, though he remained alert and watchful. Marcus made coffee with hands that were steadier than he'd expected, considering what he'd experienced during the night. As he sipped the bitter brew and watched the sunlight slowly dispel the shadows from the cabin's interior, Marcus found himself thinking about Helen Cartwright's final warning: once they know you're aware of them, they'll never leave you alone. The rational part of his mind suggested that he pack up immediately and drive back to Portland, return the deed to the realtor, chalk the whole experience up to a combination of isolation, stress, and an overactive imagination fed by an old woman's delusions. But the stubborn part of him, the part that had carried him through 2 tours of duty and months of rehabilitation, refused to back down. He'd come here to find peace, and he wasn't going to be driven away by night sounds and childhood fears. Besides, Scout was calmer now that the sun was up. The dog had even ventured outside to explore the immediate area around the cabin, though he stayed well clear of the tree line. Whatever had been active during the night seemed to have retreated with the darkness. Marcus spent the morning conducting a thorough inspection of the cabin's interior, taking inventory of what needed to be repaired or replaced. The work gave him something concrete to focus on, a series of practical problems that could be solved with tools and effort, rather than courage and blind faith. The bedroom was in better condition than the main room, with only minor water damage and a window that could be repaired, rather than completely boarded over. The kitchen area had a hand pump that still drew water from the well, though the pipes would need to be checked for leaks. Most importantly, the fireplace appeared to be structurally sound, which meant he could heat the cabin properly once he cleared the debris from the chimney. It was while he was examining the fireplace that Marcus made his second disturbing discovery of the day. Hidden behind a loose stone in the hearth was another cache, this one containing a more recent journal. The handwriting was different, masculine where Helen's had been feminine, and the dates were from the 1980s. Day 12, the first entry read, "Found Helen Cartwright's journal yesterday. Should have listened to her warning and left immediately, but I was too curious for my own good. The things she wrote about, I thought they were just the ravings of an old woman who'd spent too much time alone. Now I know better." The writer identified himself as David Mitchell, a graduate student in folklore who had come to research local legends for his thesis. Like Marcus, he'd bought the property for almost nothing, drawn by the isolation and the opportunity to study rural mythology without interference. Day 18. They're getting bolder. Last night one of them actually came inside the cabin. I woke up to find small muddy footprints leading from the door to my bedside and back again. Whatever it was, it stood there watching me sleep for God knows how long before leaving. Marcus felt his blood chill as he read the account. He looked down at the floor around his sleeping bag, and his heart skipped a beat. There, barely visible in the dust and debris, were similar footprints, small with elongated toes and what looked like claw marks at the tips. Scout noticed Marcus's distraction and came over to investigate, sniffing at the tracks with obvious agitation. The dog's reaction confirmed what Marcus already suspected. The footprints were fresh, probably made during the night, while he'd been listening to the scratching and singing. He continued reading David Mitchell's journal with growing unease. Day 23. Found the source. There's a cave system about half a mile north of the cabin, hidden behind a rockfall that looks natural but isn't. The entrance is narrow, maybe 3 feet wide, but it opens up into a larger chamber. The smell that comes out of it is indescribable. Sweet and rotten at the same time, like flowers left too long in standing water. Marcus made a mental note of the location. Against his better judgment, he found himself curious about this cave system. If there was a rational explanation for what was happening here, if these children were actually some kind of animal, or if there was a natural phenomenon that could account for the sounds and movements, then investigating might be the key to reclaiming his peace of mind. Day 27. Made the mistake of going into the cave. Found bones scattered throughout the main chamber. Animal bones mostly, but some that were definitely human. Old bones, based on the mineralization, but arranged in patterns that couldn't be natural. Someone or something has been using that cave for a very long time. The handwriting became increasingly erratic as the entries continued. Day 30. They don't want me to leave. Every time I try to pack up and go, something stops me. Yesterday it was my truck, all 4 tires slashed during the night. Before that they took my car keys and I found them a week later hanging from a tree branch 50 feet off the ground. It's like they're playing with me, seeing how far they can push before I break completely. Day 35. I understand now why Helen's husband died. It wasn't an accident. They drove him to it, just like they're trying to drive me. The constant watching, the sounds in the night, the sense that you're never truly alone, it wears on your mind until you can't think straight anymore. I can feel my sanity fraying at the edges, but I can't seem to stop myself from staying. The final entry was dated 3 days later, day 38. I'm going to try the cave again tonight. I think there's something deeper in the system, something I missed the first time.
Maybe if I can find the source of all this, I can make it stop. If anyone finds this journal, don't make the same mistake I did. Don't try to understand them. Don't try to communicate with them. Just leave. Leave and never come back. There were no more entries after that. Marcus closed the journal and sat back on his heels, staring at the dead fireplace. 2 people had owned this property before him, and both had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The smart thing would be to heed their warnings and get out while he still could. But Marcus had never been accused of being particularly smart, and he'd faced enough real monsters in Afghanistan to be skeptical of supernatural explanations.
There had to be a logical reason for what was happening here, some natural phenomenon or human activity that could account for the strange sounds and movements. Scout had been pacing near the door while Marcus read, occasionally whining and scratching to be let outside. When Marcus finally opened the door, the dog bolted out into the afternoon sunlight, immediately heading for the tree line, where he'd focused his attention the night before. Marcus followed, keeping the cabin in sight, but allowing Scout to lead the way. The dog moved with purpose, his nose to the ground, following some scent trail that was invisible to human senses. They walked for perhaps 20 minutes through the dense pine forest before Scout stopped abruptly, his body going rigid with the same tension Marcus had observed the previous day. They were standing at the edge of a small clearing, roughly circular and perhaps 30 feet across. The ground was bare earth, hard-packed as if it had been trampled repeatedly over a long period of time. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each one roughly the size of a human head, arranged with geometric precision, but it was what lay beyond the stone circle that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The tree line on the far side of the clearing was hung with objects, dozens of them suspended from branches at varying heights. From a distance they looked almost decorative, like some kind of primitive wind chimes. As Marcus moved closer, he realized what he was looking at. Bones, human bones by the look of them, though bleached white by years of exposure to the elements. Femurs and tibias hung alongside smaller bones that might have been from hands or feet. Skulls were mounted on higher branches, their empty sockets staring down at the stone circle below. Scout refused to enter the clearing, instead circling its perimeter with obvious agitation. His hackles were raised, and he emitted a constant low growl that spoke of primal fear rather than mere caution. Marcus counted at least 40 skulls, which suggested that this place had been in use for decades, possibly centuries. The arrangement was too deliberate to be the work of animals, and the bones were too clean to be recent deaths. Whatever was happening here had been going on for a very long time. As he studied the grisly display, Marcus became aware of a sound that seemed to come from the forest itself, a low humming that wasn't quite music, but wasn't quite random noise either. It rose and fell in patterns that suggested intention, communication, perhaps even language. The humming grew louder as the afternoon light began to fade, and Marcus realized that he and Scout were no longer alone in the clearing. There were shapes moving between the trees, small quick movements that stayed just outside the range of clear vision. When he tried to focus on any individual figure, it would disappear, only to reappear somewhere else, moments later. Scout's agitation increased to the point where the dog was practically vibrating with nervous energy. Marcus made the decision to retreat, backing slowly away from the clearing while keeping his eyes on the tree line. As they put distance between themselves and the bone display, the humming faded and the sense of being watched gradually diminished. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and Marcus found himself dreading the approach of another night. The rational part of his mind insisted that there had to be an explanation for what he'd seen, some kind of cult activity, perhaps, or elaborate hoax designed to keep trespassers away from the property. But David Mitchell's journal had mentioned a cave system, and the bone circle suggested that whatever was happening here was older and more organized than random cult activity. Marcus found himself thinking about the stories his grandfather had told him as a child, Native American legends about creatures that lived between the world of the living and the world of the dead, things that were neither human nor animal, but something altogether different. As darkness settled over the forest for the second time since his arrival, Marcus prepared for another sleepless night. He barricaded the door with furniture salvaged from the cabin's previous occupants and positioned Scout near the window where the dog could watch for movement outside. The scratching began around 10 o'clock, this time coming from multiple locations around the cabin's perimeter. It was accompanied by that same childlike singing, though now Marcus could make out individual voices, at least 5 or 6 different children, all singing the same haunting melody, but slightly out of time with each other.
Scout's behavior was different tonight. Instead of simply growling and watching, the dog began to pace frantically around the cabin's interior, pausing at each wall to listen intently before moving on to the next. It was as if he was tracking multiple threats simultaneously, trying to keep watch on dangers that were surrounding them from all sides. Around midnight, the singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Scout stopped pacing and stood absolutely still in the center of the room, his ears pricked forward and his body tense with anticipation. Then came the voices. Not singing this time, but speaking, calling out in what sounded like a mixture of English and something else, some language that predated European settlement of the region. The words were distorted, as if they were being spoken through water or from a great distance, but Marcus could make out fragments. Come out, play with us, been so long, new friend. The voices seemed to come from directly outside the cabin now, moving around the perimeter in a slow circle. Scout whined and pressed himself against Marcus's leg, seeking comfort from the only source of protection available. Marcus found himself thinking about Helen Cartwright's warning, once they know you're aware of them, they'll never leave you alone. Had he already crossed that line by reading the journals, by visiting the bone circle, by staying here despite every instinct telling him to run? The voices continued for hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening, always maintaining that childlike quality that made them simultaneously innocent and terrifying. They spoke of games and friendship, of secrets hidden in the dark places beneath the earth, of hungers that could only be satisfied by those who understood what it meant to be truly alone. As dawn approached, Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He wasn't leaving, not yet. These things, whatever they were, had driven away 2 previous owners of this property through fear and intimidation. They'd claimed at least 1 life, possibly more, and they'd been using that bone circle for purposes he didn't want to contemplate. But Marcus had been trained to fight monsters, even if he'd never expected them to take this particular form. His war in Afghanistan was over, but perhaps his real war was just beginning. If these creatures thought they could terrorize him into abandoning the first place he'd felt truly safe since returning from overseas, they were about to discover just how stubborn a veteran with nothing left to lose could be. Scout seemed to sense the change in Marcus's demeanor. As the sun rose and the voices faded back into the forest, the dog moved to sit beside his master, no longer cowering but alert and ready. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together. The morning brought with it a deceptive sense of normalcy that Marcus had learned not to trust. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the boarded windows, casting geometric patterns across the cabin floor, where Scout lay stretched out, finally able to rest after the night of vigilance. The forest outside appeared peaceful, almost idyllic, with birds calling from the pine branches and a gentle breeze stirring the undergrowth. But Marcus had spent enough time in hostile territory to recognize a false calm when he saw one. He spent the early hours of the day preparing for what he increasingly understood to be a siege. Years of military training had taught him that the best defense was preparation, and if these entities thought they could wear him down through psychological warfare, they were underestimating what 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him about endurance under pressure. Marcus began by conducting a thorough reconnaissance of his immediate area, mapping every approach to the cabin and identifying potential defensive positions. The structure sat in a natural depression surrounded by rising ground on 3 sides, which provided some protection but also created obvious disadvantage points where attackers could gain elevated positions. He noted every large tree within 50 yards, every boulder that could provide cover, every dip in the terrain that might conceal movement. Scout accompanied him on these surveys, his demeanor noticeably different in daylight. The dog moved with confidence now, investigating scents and sounds with the curiosity of a normal animal, rather than the terror he'd displayed during the nighttime encounters. But Marcus noticed that Scout still avoided the northern approaches to the cabin, the direction that led toward the bone circle they'd discovered the previous afternoon. The first order of business was securing the cabin's perimeter. Marcus retrieved his toolbox from the truck and began reinforcing the boarded windows, adding extra supports and sealing gaps that might allow small intruders to gain entry. He'd brought a variety of supplies with him, anticipating that the remote location would require self-sufficiency, but now he found himself grateful for items he'd packed almost as afterthoughts: motion-activated lights, battery-powered radios, even a set of military-grade night vision goggles he'd acquired through surplus channels. As he worked, Marcus found his mind returning to David Mitchell's description of the cave system. The graduate student had mentioned finding bones arranged in patterns, suggesting some kind of ritualistic behavior. More importantly, he'd indicated that there was something deeper in the cave system, something he'd planned to investigate on his final night. If Marcus was going to understand what he was dealing with, he needed to see this cave for himself. The decision to explore went against every survival instinct he'd developed, both in the military and in his current situation. But Marcus had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes the only way to neutralize a threat was to understand it completely. Sitting in the cabin and waiting for the next nighttime assault would eventually wear down his defenses. Better to take the initiative while he still had the advantage of daylight and preparation time. Scout seemed to sense his intentions and displayed obvious reluctance as Marcus gathered equipment for the expedition. The dog whined and paced, occasionally blocking the doorway as if trying to prevent Marcus from leaving. But when it became clear that Marcus was determined to proceed, Scout reluctantly took his position at his master's side, the loyalty that had sustained them both through 2 years of recovery, overriding his instinctual fear. The walk to the cave took longer than David Mitchell's journal had suggested, partly because Marcus moved with military caution, checking each direction for threats, and partly because the landmarks described in the 1980s had changed over the intervening decades. Fallen trees and new growth had altered the landscape, and it took considerable searching before Scout's nose led them to the rockfall that concealed the cave entrance. The opening was exactly as described, narrow enough that Marcus had to remove his pack and squeeze through sideways, but widening immediately into a larger chamber. The smell that emerged from the darkness was unlike anything he'd encountered in nature. It carried the sweetness of decay overlaid with something mineral and cold, as if the earth itself had been corrupted by whatever activities had taken place within. Marcus activated his military-grade flashlight and swept the beam across the chamber's interior. The cave was larger than he'd expected, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the reach of his light. The floor was covered with a thick layer of what looked like mulch, decomposed organic matter that squelched unpleasantly under his boots. But it was the walls that captured his attention. They were covered with markings that appeared to have been carved directly into the stone, symbols and pictographs that followed no pattern he could recognize. Some looked almost like primitive writing, while others seemed to depict scenes of hunting or ritual. Near the back of the chamber, the carvings became more elaborate, showing what appeared to be processions of small figures leading larger ones towards some kind of opening in the earth. Scout refused to enter the cave, instead positioning himself at the entrance where he could watch for threats from outside. The dog's agitation was obvious, but he seemed to understand that his role was to serve as an early warning system rather than to accompany Marcus into the depths. As Marcus moved deeper into the chamber, his flashlight beam picked out the bones that David Mitchell had described. They were scattered throughout the space, but not randomly, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement. Some were clearly animal bones, probably deer and smaller forest creatures, but others were unmistakably human. The arrangement seemed to follow the same logic as the carvings on the walls, creating pathways that led toward the back of the chamber. Following these bone pathways, Marcus discovered what Mitchell had missed during his initial exploration: a second opening in the rear wall of the cave, partially concealed by a natural rock formation. The passage beyond was even narrower than the entrance, requiring him to crawl on hands and knees, but it opened into another chamber that took his breath away. This deeper cave was cathedral-like in its proportions, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness far above his strongest flashlight beam. The walls here were covered with more elaborate carvings, but these were different from the primitive markings in the outer chamber. These showed a level of artistry and detail that suggested a sophisticated culture, one that had spent considerable time and effort documenting something of great importance. The carvings told a story, Marcus realized as he studied them more carefully. They depicted the arrival of something from beneath the earth, creatures that emerged from deep caves and holes to interact with the human inhabitants of the surface world. The early panels showed what appeared to be peaceful contact, with the underground beings offering gifts and knowledge to humans who ventured into their domain. But as the story progressed along the walls, the nature of these interactions changed. The underground beings began to demand offerings, first animals, then humans. The surface dwellers who refused these demands faced consequences that were depicted in increasingly disturbing detail. Families torn apart, villages abandoned, crops failing, and always the suggestion that the underground beings could reach into the surface world to claim what they believed was owed to them.
The final panels showed what appeared to be a compact or agreement. Humans would provide regular offerings to the underground beings, and in return, they would be left in peace. But the carvings also suggested that this agreement came with conditions. Certain locations were to be avoided by humans, certain times of year required special observances, and most importantly, those who lived near the entrances to the underground realm had responsibilities to serve as intermediaries between the two worlds. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a record of some ancient mythology, it was a manual, a set of instructions for maintaining the agreement depicted on the walls. And if the bone circle he'd discovered was any indication, this agreement was still being honored by someone. The sound of Scout barking from the cave entrance broke Marcus's concentration. The dog's bark had a specific urgency that Marcus had learned to recognize. It meant immediate danger approaching. Marcus quickly gathered his equipment and began the crawl back through the narrow passage, his heart rate accelerating as Scout's barking became more frantic. He emerged from the outer chamber to find Scout in full defensive posture, hackles raised and teeth bared, facing something in the forest that Marcus couldn't immediately see. The late afternoon light filtering through the trees created a confusing pattern of shadows and movement, but Marcus could sense that they were no longer alone. Then he saw them, small figures moving between the trees, staying just outside the range of clear vision but definitely present and definitely watching. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, appearing at one tree and disappearing only to reappear at another location moments later. Scout's barking had attracted their attention, and Marcus could feel their focus shifting from the dog to him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Marcus backed slowly toward the cave entrance, not wanting to turn his back on the watchers, but also not wanting to be trapped in the narrow opening. Scout maintained his defensive position, occasionally darting forward a few steps before returning to his master's side. The dog's behavior suggested that the watchers were maintaining a specific distance, as if they were bound by some kind of rule or limitation that prevented them from approaching too closely during daylight hours. The standoff lasted perhaps 10 minutes before the watchers began to withdraw, melting back into the forest as mysteriously as they had appeared. Scout's posture gradually relaxed, though he remained alert and ready. Marcus waited another 5 minutes before beginning the trek back to the cabin, his mind racing with the implications of what he'd discovered in the deep cave. The carvings suggested that these entities, whatever they were, had been interacting with humans in this area for centuries, possibly millennia. The bone circle wasn't just some random cult activity, it was part of an ancient system of appeasement that had somehow survived into the modern era. And if the pattern held, then Marcus's presence on this land had automatically made him a participant in whatever agreement the carvings described. The walk back to the cabin passed without incident, but Marcus remained hyper-aware of their surroundings.
Scout's behavior suggested that they were being followed at a distance, tracked by entities that seemed content to observe for now, but might have more aggressive intentions once darkness fell again. As they approached the cabin, Marcus noticed something that made him stop abruptly. The door, which he'd carefully closed and barricaded before leaving, stood slightly ajar. Scout noticed it too, his body tensing as he caught scents that shouldn't be there. Someone or something had been inside the cabin during their absence. Marcus approached the building with tactical precision, using the same methods he'd employed during house clearances in Afghanistan. He signaled for Scout to stay back while he checked the perimeter, looking for signs of forced entry or concealment points where intruders might be hiding. The windows remained boarded and secure, and there were no obvious signs of damage to the structure. But when Marcus pushed the door fully open and stepped inside, he immediately saw evidence of the intrusion. His sleeping bag had been moved, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable to someone with his training. His backpack, which he'd left carefully organized near the fireplace, showed signs of having been searched. Most disturbing, someone had left a gift. Sitting in the exact center of the main room was a small pile of objects that hadn't been there when Marcus left. Bird bones, smooth river stones, and what appeared to be carved pieces of wood or antler, all arranged in a precise pattern that echoed the designs he'd seen on the cave walls. The arrangement was clearly deliberate, a message of some kind, though Marcus wasn't sure if it was meant as a threat or an offering. Scout entered the cabin cautiously, sniffing at the arrangement without getting too close. The dog's behavior suggested that the scents were unfamiliar but not immediately threatening. Whatever had left these items hadn't done so with hostile intent, at least not obviously hostile. Marcus photographed the arrangement with his phone before carefully disturbing it, examining each item for clues about its origin or meaning. The bones appeared to be from various small birds, cleaned and bleached until they were perfectly white. The stones were river smooth and uniform in size, suggesting they'd been selected rather than randomly gathered. The carved pieces were the most intriguing. They appeared to be made from deer antler and bore symbols that matched some of the simpler markings he'd seen in the cave. As he studied the items, Marcus began to understand that he was looking at some kind of communication attempt. The arrangement wasn't random, it followed the same organizational principles as the bone pathways in the cave and the carvings on the walls. Someone or something was trying to establish contact using a symbolic language that predated written communication. The question was whether this contact attempt was friendly or hostile. The carvings in the deep cave had suggested that peaceful coexistence was possible under the right circumstances, but they'd also made it clear that the underground beings had very specific expectations about how such relationships should be conducted. Marcus spent the remainder of the afternoon studying the arrangement and comparing it to his memories of the cave carvings. He sketched the pattern in his notebook, trying to decode any obvious meaning, but the symbols remained largely incomprehensible. What was clear was that leaving these items in his cabin represented a significant escalation in the entity's behavior. They were no longer content to simply watch and intimidate. They were actively trying to communicate. As sunset approached, Marcus prepared for another night of contact, but this time with a different strategy. Instead of barricading himself in the cabin and waiting for whatever might come, he decided to respond to the communication attempt. If these entities operated according to some kind of social structure with rules and expectations, then perhaps it was possible to establish a more predictable relationship with them. Marcus carefully gathered the items from the arrangement and carried them outside to a flat area between the cabin and the tree line. He recreated the pattern exactly as he'd found it, then added something of his own, a small metal compass from his military kit, polished until it gleamed in the fading light. It wasn't much, but it represented the same kind of thoughtful selection that had gone into the original offering. Scout watched these preparations with obvious unease, staying close to Marcus, but clearly unhappy with the direction events were taking. The dog's instincts told him that engaging with the entities was dangerous, but his loyalty to Marcus overrode his desire to flee. As darkness settled over the forest, Marcus positioned himself on the cabin's front step where he could observe the offering area while remaining relatively protected. Scout lay beside him, tense and alert but no longer displaying the extreme agitation that had characterized his behavior during the previous nights. The entity's response came more quickly than Marcus had expected. As soon as full darkness descended, figures began emerging from the tree line, not hiding or skulking as they had before, but moving with deliberate purpose toward the offering arrangement. Marcus forced himself to remain still and non-threatening, fighting every instinct that told him to reach for a weapon or seek cover. The figures were smaller than he'd expected, roughly the size of children but moving with an alien grace that immediately marked them as something other than human. Their skin appeared pale in the starlight, almost luminescent, and their limbs seemed slightly too long for their bodies. They approached the offering with obvious reverence, examining each item carefully before beginning to rearrange the pattern. Marcus watched in fascination as they transformed his simple recreation into something far more complex. They added items of their own, more bones, stones that seemed to glow with their own internal light, and what appeared to be preserved flowers or plants that retained their color despite obvious age. The new arrangement was beautiful in an otherworldly way, creating patterns that seemed to shift and flow even when Marcus wasn't looking directly at them. When they finished their work, the figures stepped back and turned their attention to Marcus. For the first time he got a clear look at their faces, and what he saw sent ice through his veins. They had human features, but distorted in subtle ways that fell squarely into the uncanny valley. Their eyes were too large and entirely black, reflecting no light. Their mouths were too wide, and when they smiled, which they did frequently, their teeth appeared sharp and numerous. But despite their disturbing appearance, their behavior suggested intelligence and even a form of courtesy. They gestured toward the new arrangement, then toward Marcus, clearly indicating that this was meant as a response to his communication attempt. One of them, slightly larger than the others, approached closer to the cabin and spoke in a voice that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "New keeper comes, old keeper gone long time. We wait, we watch, we hope for understanding." The words were English, but spoken with an accent that suggested the language was foreign to the speaker. Marcus found his voice after a moment of shock. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head in a gesture that was almost human. "Same want as always, same need as always. The agreement, the feeding, the quiet." Marcus felt his blood chill as he remembered the cave carvings depicting human sacrifices. What kind of feeding? Not blood feeding, not flesh feeding. The figure gestured toward the arrangement. Memory feeding, dream feeding, fear feeding, loneliness feeding. You have much, you share. We quiet, we protect, we leave others alone. The explanation was both more and less disturbing than Marcus had expected. These entities apparently fed on negative emotions and experiences rather than physical sustenance. In a twisted way, it made sense. Marcus had certainly brought plenty of psychological trauma to this location, more than enough to sustain a colony of psychic parasites. "And if I refuse?" Marcus asked. The figure's smile widened, revealing more of those sharp teeth. "You no refuse. You already feeding us. Since first night. Fear tastes sweet. Guilt tastes sweeter. Memory of war tastes sweetest of all." Marcus realized with growing horror that he'd been manipulated from the moment he'd arrived. The nighttime visitations, the psychological pressure, even his decision to stay and fight, all of it had been orchestrated to maximize his emotional output. He'd thought he was being strong and defiant, but he'd actually been providing exactly what these creatures wanted. "Previous keepers," Marcus said, thinking of Helen Cartwright and David Mitchell. "What happened to them?" "Lady Keeper. She fight too hard. Make herself sick with fighting. We no want sick food. She leave we let her. Man Keeper. He want to understand too much. Go deep places hungry for more than dream feeding. We warn him. He no listen." The implication was clear. David Mitchell had ventured too deep into the cave system and encountered something even more dangerous than the surface entities. Marcus filed that information away for future consideration. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Marcus said.
Live here, let us feed, no bring others, no tell others, no go deep places. In return, we protect land, we keep others away, we make quiet place for warsick keeper. It was, Marcus realized, exactly what he'd come here seeking. These entities were offering him the isolation and protection he craved, in exchange for allowing them to feed on the psychological darkness he brought with him from Afghanistan. It was a symbiotic relationship of sorts, even if the terms were disturbing. But Marcus had learned in the military that any deal that seemed too good to be true probably was.
"What? Aren't you telling me?"
He asked. The figure's expression shifted to something that might have been approval. Smart keeper, good keeper. Yes, more terms. Feeding seasons. Dark months, we need more. Light months, we need less. Sometimes special feeding times. Then we need very much. You give us big fear, big memory. We leave you alone for long time after. Special feeding times. When veil thin, when deep things stir, when others like us wake hungry, you feed us strong then. We protect you from them. Otherwise, the figure shrugged, a gesture that was grotesquely human coming from such an alien form. Marcus understood. These surface entities were offering protection from something worse that lurked in the deeper cave system. The price was allowing them to intensify their psychic feeding during certain periods, probably around solstices or other traditionally supernatural times. It was a devil's bargain, but Marcus had made worse deals in Afghanistan, when survival was at stake. And the alternative, fighting an indefinite war against entities he didn't understand, seemed far less appealing than a negotiated peace, however unusual the terms. "I need time to think about this," Marcus said. The figure nodded. "You think, you decide. But know this, agreement already begun. First night you stay, first time you fear, first time you remember war, that feeding, we know give back. Question now is whether feeding continue with agreement or without agreement. With agreement, better for all. Without agreement, the figure gestured toward the forest, where Marcus could now see dozens of pale shapes moving between the trees. The message was clear. Marcus could accept the formal arrangement and have some control over the terms, or he could continue as an unwilling food source for however long he lasted. Given those options, the choice was obvious. "What do I need to do to formalize this agreement?" Marcus asked. The figure smiled again, and this time the expression seemed genuinely pleased rather than threatening. "Keeper learns quick. Good. Come to sacred place. Bring offerings, speak words, make commitment. Then we all understand each other." Marcus assumed the sacred place meant the bone circle he'd discovered. The prospect of a nighttime visit to that location filled him with dread, but he'd committed himself to seeing this through. "When? Tomorrow night. When moon dark. Bring metal thing you gave. Bring something of wartime. Bring something of blood. We make ceremony. We make peace." With that, the figure stepped back and gestured to its companions. They quickly gathered the offering arrangement, leaving only Marcus's compass behind, and melted back into the forest as silently as they'd appeared. Within moments, Marcus and Scout were alone again, though the air seemed to retain some residual charge of otherworldly presence. Scout had remained remarkably calm during the entire encounter, as if the absence of immediate threat had allowed him to overcome his instinctual fear. Now he moved to Marcus's side and leaned against his leg, offering the comfort that had sustained them both through countless difficult nights. Marcus spent the remainder of the night considering what he'd agreed to. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was suffering from some kind of psychological break, that isolation and stress had caused him to construct an elaborate fantasy involving supernatural entities. But the compass sitting in the dirt where otherworldly hands had placed it suggested otherwise.
Whether these creatures were real or products of his damaged psyche, they were offering him something he'd been unable to find anywhere else, a place where his psychological wounds could serve a purpose rather than simply causing pain. If feeding his trauma to psychic parasites was the price of finding peace, then perhaps it was a price worth paying. As dawn broke over the forest, Marcus began preparing for the ceremony that would formalize his relationship with the entities. He gathered the items they'd requested, his military compass, a piece of shrapnel he'd carried since taking it in his leg during his second tour, and a small vial of his own blood, drawn with a sterile needle from his medical kit. The preparations felt ritualistic in a way that reminded him of certain Afghan customs he'd observed, formal acknowledgements of relationships and obligations that carried weight beyond simple agreements. Whatever was about to happen, Marcus sensed that it would bind him to this place and these entities in ways he might not fully understand. But as he watched Scout explore the morning forest, with something approaching normal canine curiosity, Marcus felt a sense of rightness about his decision. He'd come here seeking isolation and quiet. If achieving those goals required sharing his psychological darkness with creatures that found it nourishing rather than poisonous, then perhaps he'd finally found a place where his war wounds could heal rather than fester. The day passed quietly, with no sign of the entities during daylight hours. Marcus used the time to fortify his position further, not because he expected hostility, but because military habits died hard. By evening, he was as ready as he could be for whatever the formal ceremony might entail. As sunset approached, Marcus gathered his offerings and set out for the bone circle, Scout padding silently beside him. The forest seemed different now, less threatening and more watchful. The entities had shown themselves capable of communication and negotiation, which suggested a level of intelligence and social organization that made them less frightening than unknown threats. The bone circle looked even more ominous in the gathering darkness, but Marcus forced himself to approach it with the same calm determination he'd used during night patrols in Afghanistan. This was a mission with specific objectives and acceptable risk parameters. The fact that those parameters included psychic feeding by supernatural entities was unusual, but not necessarily more dangerous than some of the situations he'd survived overseas. As he reached the circle's edge, Marcus heard the now familiar sound of movement in the surrounding trees. The entities were gathering, more of them than he'd seen before, creating a loose perimeter around the sacred space. The figure he'd spoken with the previous night emerged from the tree line and approached the circle's center. "Keeper comes. Good. We begin." Marcus stepped into the circle, feeling an immediate change in the atmosphere around him. The air seemed thicker, charged with potential energy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Scout whined softly but followed, staying close to Marcus's side. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced. The entities arranged themselves around the circle's perimeter and began a low harmonic humming that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. The sound was not unpleasant, but it carried undertones that spoke to something deeper than conscious hearing. The lead entity gestured for Marcus to place his offerings in the circle's center. As he did so, the humming intensified, and Marcus felt a strange tingling sensation wash over him. It was as if invisible fingers were exploring his memories, sifting through his experiences, and selecting specific moments for closer examination. The sensation was intensely uncomfortable, but not painful. Marcus felt his consciousness drift back to specific moments from his tours in Afghanistan, not the worst memories, but ones laden with particular emotional significance. The firefight where he'd earned his Purple Heart, the night he'd spent hiding in a cave while enemy forces searched for his unit, the moment he'd realized that the war was changing him into someone he didn't recognize. As each memory surfaced, Marcus felt it being somehow tasted, examined, appreciated. The entities were feeding on these experiences, but not consuming them entirely. Instead, they seemed to be extracting the emotional essence while leaving the core memories intact. It was deeply unsettling, but also strangely therapeutic, as if sharing these burdens with creatures that found them nourishing somehow lessened their psychological weight. The process continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it finally ended, Marcus felt drained but also oddly cleansed. The memories were still there, but their emotional charge had been significantly reduced. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he felt as though he might actually be able to sleep peacefully. The lead entity approached him as the humming faded. Agreement made. Keeper feeds us, we protect Keeper. Keeper stays in light places, we deal with dark places. Keeper brings no others, we keep others away. Good trade, good peace. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice after the intensity of the experience. He felt fundamentally changed in ways he couldn't yet articulate, bound to this place and these entities by something stronger than simple contracts. As the entities began to disperse back into the forest, the lead figure offered one final piece of information. Sleep now, Keeper. Tomorrow we show you boundaries, show you safe places, show you how to live in peace with old things. Welcome to deep forest. Welcome to quiet place. Marcus made his way back to the cabin with Scout at his side, both of them moving slowly through the darkness. The forest no longer felt threatening, it felt protected, watched over by entities that now had a vested interest in his well-being. For the first time since arriving, Marcus felt truly safe. As he settled into his sleeping bag, Scout curled up beside him for warmth. Marcus realized that he'd found what he'd been searching for. Not just isolation, but a place where his psychological wounds could serve a purpose, where his trauma could feed something that offered protection in return, where his war could finally truly come to an end. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was the soft sound of the entities moving through the forest around his cabin, standing guard against threats he couldn't see. He'd made his peace with the darkness, and the darkness had made its peace with him. Marcus woke to silence deeper than any he'd experienced since arriving at the cabin. The familiar weight of Scout pressed against his side, but something felt different. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized his nights here was gone, replaced by a calm that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the boarded windows, but it carried a quality of peace rather than the harsh illumination of previous mornings. 3 months had passed since the ceremony at the Bone Circle, and Marcus had settled into a routine that would have seemed impossible during his first terrifying nights. The entities whom he'd learned to think of as the Watchers maintained their end of the agreement with almost mechanical precision. They fed on his trauma during the designated times, leaving him with a clarity of mind he hadn't experienced since before Afghanistan. In return, they kept the forest free of human intruders and protected him from whatever deeper threats lurked in the cave system beneath the mountain. The arrangement had proven more beneficial than Marcus had dared hope. His nightmares had virtually disappeared, not because the memories were gone, but because sharing them with creatures that found them nourishing had somehow drained their emotional poison. He still remembered every detail of his combat experiences, but they no longer carried the crushing weight that had driven him to this isolated place. Scout had adapted to their unusual neighbors with remarkable resilience. The dog no longer showed fear when the Watchers emerged from the tree line during their feeding periods. Instead, he seemed to regard them as simply another part of the forest ecosystem, no different from the deer that grazed near the cabin or the hawks that circled overhead. But on this particular morning, something was wrong. Marcus felt it the moment consciousness returned, a tension in the air that reminded him of the minutes before enemy contact in Afghanistan. Scout sensed it too, his body rigid with alertness despite the apparent tranquility outside. Marcus dressed quickly and stepped onto the cabin's front porch, scanning the tree line for signs of disturbance. The forest appeared normal, but his military-trained instincts screamed danger. After months of supernatural peace, his human intuition for conventional threats had sharpened rather than dulled. The sound of an engine approaching on the access road confirmed his suspicions. Marcus watched a black SUV navigate the rutted track toward his cabin, its clean lines and tinted windows immediately identifying it as a government vehicle. Scout growled low in his throat,
remembering perhaps some ancestral memory of authority figures who brought nothing but trouble. The vehicle stopped 50 yards from the cabin, and two figures emerged. The first was a woman in her 40s, wearing the kind of practical outdoor clothing that suggested she was accustomed to field work. Her companion was younger, a man whose nervous energy and constant scanning of the surroundings marked him as either law enforcement or military. Marcus remained on his porch, hands visible but ready. 3 months of psychic feeding had left him calmer than he'd been in years, but it hadn't made him careless. These people had come here for a specific purpose, and their arrival threatened the delicate balance he'd established with the watchers. The woman approached first, stopping at a respectful distance. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, anthropological consultant with the Department of the Interior. This is Agent Rodriguez from the Forest Service. We'd like to speak with you about some unusual reports we've been receiving about this area." Marcus nodded acknowledgement but didn't invite them closer. "What kind of reports?" Dr. Chen consulted a tablet she carried. "Missing hikers, unusual acoustic phenomena, and some rather disturbing archaeological discoveries in the surrounding national forest. We understand you've been living here for several months. Have you noticed anything out of the ordinary?" The question was loaded with implication. Marcus could sense that these weren't routine inquiries. Someone had connected this location to patterns of disappearances and strange occurrences. The arrival of federal investigators suggested that the Watchers' activities had attracted attention from sources with considerable resources. "It's been quiet," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. "I came here for the isolation, haven't seen any hikers or had any problems." Agent Rodriguez stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "Mr. Sullivan, we've reviewed your military record. 2 tours in Afghanistan, decorated combat veteran discharged with PTSD. We're not here to cause you any trouble, but we need to understand what's been happening in these woods." Marcus felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the detached analytical state that had kept him alive during combat operations. These investigators knew more than they were revealing, and their presence here represented a direct threat to his arrangement with the Watchers. "I think you should leave," Marcus said quietly. "This is private property, and I haven't broken any laws." Dr. Chen held up her hands in a placating gesture. "Mr. Sullivan, we're not accusing you of anything, but we have evidence of ritual activity in this area dating back decades. Bone arrangements, carved symbols, sites that suggest ongoing supernatural practices. As an anthropologist, I find it fascinating. As a concerned citizen, I find it deeply troubling." The mention of ritual activity sent ice through Marcus's veins. If these investigators had discovered the bone circle, or worse, the cave system, then his peaceful arrangement was about to become significantly more complicated. "I don't know anything about rituals," Marcus said. "I keep to myself, and I expect others to do the same." Agent Rodriguez consulted his own notes. 3 missing persons in the last 18 months, all experienced hikers who were exploring this general area. The most recent was David Chen, Dr. Chen's brother. He was researching local folklore when he disappeared 6 weeks ago. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. Dr. Chen wasn't just a government consultant, she was a grieving sister using her professional credentials to investigate her brother's disappearance. That made her far more dangerous than a routine federal inquiry. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marcus said to Dr. Chen, "but I can't help you. I haven't seen any hikers." Dr. Chen's composed facade cracked slightly. "My brother was investigating stories about this place. Native American legends about entities that live between worlds, settlers' accounts of children's voices in the woods, modern reports of supernatural encounters. He believed there was something genuinely paranormal happening here." Marcus maintained his neutral expression, but internally he was calculating distances and angles. If these investigators had come armed with specific knowledge about the Watchers, then his position was compromised. The entities had been clear about the consequences of bringing outsiders into their domain.
As if summoned by his thoughts, Marcus caught movement in his peripheral vision. Shapes were materializing between the trees, barely visible in the morning light but definitely present. The watchers were responding to the perceived threat, and their reaction was unlikely to be diplomatic. Scout whined softly, pressing against Marcus's leg. The dog could sense the gathering supernatural presence, and his distress was beginning to show. Agent Rodriguez noticed Scout's behavior and followed the dog's gaze toward the tree line. "What's your dog looking at?" Marcus had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether this encounter ended peacefully or catastrophically. The Watcher's protection came with obligations, and one of those was preventing outsiders from discovering their existence. But Marcus had grown fond of his isolated life, and he wasn't ready to see it destroyed by federal investigators. "You need to leave," Marcus said with quiet urgency. "Right now, don't ask questions, don't look back, just get in your vehicle and drive away." Dr. Chen stepped closer, her grief overriding her caution. "My brother left notes about this place. He wrote about voices in the night, about feeling watched, about finding evidence of non-human intelligence. If you know something, please." Her words were cut off by a sound that froze everyone in place. It started as a low humming, barely audible, but quickly grew into a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the forest itself. The trees began to sway despite the absence of wind, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Agent Rodriguez drew his weapon, training it on the tree line where pale shapes were now clearly visible. "What the hell is that?" Marcus stepped off the porch, moving between the investigators and the approaching watchers. "Lower your weapon. They don't respond well to threats." The lead watcher emerged from the forest, its alien features unmistakable in the clear morning light. Dr. Chen gasped and stumbled backward, while Rodriguez kept his gun trained on the creature despite Marcus's warning. "New ones come," the watcher said in its wind-through-leaves voice. "New ones see, not permitted. Keeper must choose." Marcus understood the ultimatum. The watchers were giving him the opportunity to handle this situation himself, but their patience was limited. If he couldn't convince the investigators to leave immediately, the entities would solve the problem permanently. "Dr. Chen," Marcus said, without taking his eyes off the watcher, "your brother came here looking for answers. He found them, but some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue." "David," Dr. Chen's voice was barely a whisper. "What happened to my brother?" The watcher tilted its head, studying the grieving woman with those black reflective eyes. When it spoke, its voice carried an unexpected note of something that might have been sympathy. "Brother Seeker went deep places. We warn, we know want. Deep places take what they want. We know can protect from deep hunger. Brother Seeker now part of deep places. Feeds different feeders." Dr. Chen collapsed to her knees, the confirmation of her worst fears destroying her composure. Agent Rodriguez kept his weapon ready, but Marcus could see the confusion and terror in the man's eyes as he tried to process what he was witnessing. "The cave system," Marcus said to Dr. Chen. "Your brother went into the deep caves, didn't he? Ignored the warnings, ignored the danger signs." Chen nodded through her tears. He thought he could document everything, prove that the legends were real. He wanted to make contact. He succeeded, the watcher said. "Deep ones grateful for gift. Brother Seeker feeds them long time now. Keeps them quiet, keeps them from rising to light places." Marcus felt sick as he understood the implication. David Chen hadn't just died in the caves. He'd become sustenance for whatever ancient entities dwelt in the deepest parts of the mountain. His sacrifice was keeping those deeper threats contained, but at a cost that no one should have to pay. "You have to leave now," Marcus told the investigators. "All of you, forget what you've seen here, forget what you've learned. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Agent Rodriguez was backing toward the SUV, his training warring with his terror. "We can't just ignore this. People have died. There are federal laws. Your laws mean nothing here," the watcher interrupted.
This place older than your law, older than your people. We make agreement with land, not with governments. More watchers were emerging from the forest now, surrounding the small group. Marcus counted at least a dozen of them, more than he'd ever seen gathered in one place. Their presence was overwhelming, pressing against his consciousness with alien intelligence and barely contained power. Dr. Chen struggled to her feet, wiping tears from her eyes. If I leave, if I never speak of this, will you at least tell me, did my brother suffer? The lead watcher considered the question with what appeared to be genuine thoughtfulness. Brother Seeker chose deep places. Choice made freely. Deep ones give visions before taking. Brother Seeker sees all knowledge, all truth, all time, suffering small price for such seeing. It wasn't much comfort, but it was more than Marcus had expected the entity to offer. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, accepting the terrible truth of her brother's fate. Come, Agent Rodriguez said quietly, holstering his weapon. We need to go. As the investigators retreated to their vehicle, the lead watcher approached Marcus. Keeper handles well, shows wisdom, but government ones bring attention. Others will come, questions will multiply, peacetime ending. Marcus felt his heart sink. The confrontation had been resolved without violence, but the watchers were right about the larger implications. Government investigators didn't simply disappear without leaving trails of paperwork and colleagues who would demand answers. What do you suggest? Marcus asked. Keeper must choose again, stay and fight new threats, or leave with honor, find new quiet place. We protect land regardless, but Keeper's peaceful time here finished. It was the choice Marcus had been dreading since the first night he'd arrived. His arrangement with the Watchers had given him months of healing and peace, but it had always been a temporary solution. The outside world had finally caught up with his hidden sanctuary. Marcus watched the black SUV disappear down the access road, carrying Dr. Chen and Agent Rodriguez back to a world of reports and investigations. Within days, this place would be swarming with federal agents, researchers and thrill-seekers drawn by rumors of supernatural activity. His isolation would be destroyed, and the Watchers would be forced to take increasingly violent measures to protect their territory. I'll leave, Marcus said quietly. Give me a week to get my affairs in order. The Watcher nodded approvingly. Wise choice. Keeper learned much here. Carried war poison when arriving. War poison gone now. Keeper healed. Can find peace in normal places now. Marcus realized the entity was right. The crushing weight of his combat trauma had been lifted through their feeding relationship. He no longer needed the extreme isolation this place provided. He could return to society, perhaps even rebuild relationships with other veterans who understood his experiences. Will you be safe here? Marcus asked. When the government comes, the Watcher's alien features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. We older than governments. We survive ice times, fire times, flood times. We survive curiosity times too. Deep places always need feeding. Always volunteers who think they're stronger than ancient hunger. Marcus spent his final week at the cabin preparing for departure and saying goodbye to the only place where he'd found true peace since Afghanistan. Scouts seemed to understand that change was coming, staying closer than usual, and occasionally whining as he watched Marcus pack their few possessions. On the last night, the Watchers gathered one final time for a farewell ceremony. The ritual was gentler than their initial agreement, focused on gratitude rather than binding. They took a final feeding from Marcus's remaining war memories, leaving him with nothing but peaceful recollections of service alongside brave men and women who'd become his military family. As dawn broke on his departure day, Marcus loaded his truck and took one last look at the cabin that had sheltered his healing. The structure looked older and more weathered than when he'd arrived, as if his presence had somehow accelerated its return to the forest. The drive down the mountain was quiet, punctuated only by scouts' occasional whine as familiar landmarks disappeared behind them. But Marcus felt no regret about leaving. The watchers had given him exactly what he'd needed, time and space to process his trauma, without the weight of well-meaning interference from people who couldn't understand his experiences. 3 days later, Marcus read about the federal investigation in a Portland newspaper. The headline read, "Geological instability forces evacuation of remote forest area." According to the official report, dangerous cave formations had been discovered that posed significant risk to hikers and researchers. The entire region had been declared off-limits pending geological surveys that would likely take years to complete. Marcus smiled as he read the article. The watchers had found their own solution to unwanted government attention. By triggering controlled collapses in the cave system, they'd created a perfectly plausible excuse to keep investigators away, while maintaining their ancient territorial claims. 6 months later, Marcus had settled into a small apartment near a VA medical center, where he volunteered with other combat veterans struggling with PTSD. His experiences with the Watchers had taught him that trauma could be shared and processed in ways that traditional therapy sometimes missed. He couldn't tell his fellow veterans about supernatural entities, but he could help them understand that their psychological wounds weren't permanent curses. Scout had adapted well to city life, though he occasionally stared toward the distant mountains with an expression that suggested he remembered their time in the deep forest. Marcus would scratch the dog's ears during these moments, grateful for the companion who'd shared his strangest and most transformative experience. Sometimes, late at night when the city was quiet, Marcus thought he could hear faint echoes of harmonic humming carried on the wind. Whether the sound was real or simply his imagination didn't matter. It reminded him that he'd found peace in the most unlikely place, with the most unusual allies, and that healing sometimes came from sources beyond human understanding. The $300 cabin had cost him far more than money. It had demanded courage, sacrifice, and acceptance of truths that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. But in return, it had given him something priceless, the ability to finally come home from war. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.